Married priests. A working document for an October synod at the Vatican explores the possibility. Notre Dame Cathedral. The first Mass since April's devastating fire is held, hard hats included. Abortions for immigrants. A U.S. appeals court rules on a Trump administration policy. We're at the White House. And a 6-day personal retreat. Father Jeffrey Kirby joins us on how to live in the present. On EWTN News Nightly for Monday, June 17th, 2019. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you to those of you joining us from around the world for news from a Catholic perspective. I'm Lauren Ashburn. The Vatican formally opens debate on whether to allow married priests in the Amazon region. Reports say there are so few clergy in that region, Catholics can go weeks or months without Mass. Now, this working document on the issue was released today ahead of an October meeting of South American bishops. Joining me now is Edward Penton, Rome correspondent for EWTN's National Catholic Register. Edward, welcome back to the broadcast. Tell us, what does the working document say about the possibility of married priests?
Well, it says two things, mainly, Lauren. The first is that the criteria for selecting and preparing men for celebrating Mass needs to be changed. But it also says that there's they call for a study into ordaining married men of a mature age who are preferably indigenous people and ordaining them into the priesthood. Now, that would be a big change because that's never happened. The Pope himself has said that he wouldn't actually want to ordain married men like that, but this has been debated for many years now, and it's really to answer the priest shortage in the Amazonian region, and so that's definitely going to be discussed.
Are clergy in Brazil in favor of this proposal?
Well, it's hard to say. I'm sure some are, but some aren't. Some I've heard have said that this is not actually needed, that there are other ways to deal with the shortage of priests in these very remote areas of the Amazonian region. And also what's interesting is that you've had bishop, or at least one bishop in Germany, supporting this, even though it's actually limited to the Amazonian region. So there's support outside of the Amazonian region for this, because I think there's a push for ordination of married men.
You know, research from the Center for Applied Research in the Apostolate, that's at Georgetown University here in Washington, says the average age of priests is 67 in the U.S. Could the debate of married priests expand to the U.S.? You say there's support in Germany, some support there.
Yes, well, this is what people think. And in fact, Cardinal Claudio Humes, who is the general relator for this synod, has pushed this for a long time. And I think he's been supportive of ordaining married men in the Latin Rite in a more widespread way. And so I think there is that possibility. But at the press conference today, Bishop Fabio Fabene, who's the Undersecretary for the Synod of Bishops, he played that down. He said that the only universal aspect of this synod relates to ecology and the environment, and that when it comes to ordaining married men, it's going to be limited to the region, the Amazonian region. What
else did officials say at this press conference today?
Well, it was quite interesting because there is some concern about this synod that it's going to be a sort of what's one critic called recycling liberation theology, a sort of liberation theology through the back door. Now, that's been criticized in the past for having sort of Marxist elements to it. But today, Cardinal Baldessari, I asked this question to him. He's the Secretary General of the Synod of Bishops, and he said, well, there are some various different kinds of liberation theology. They're not all bad. But he said it wouldn't become a sort of syncretic new church, which some people fear through this synod. And he said that actually, anyway, this document is not definitive, and that we're going to have to just wait and see what it's going to be like at the synod in October.
Edward Penton, Rome correspondent for EWTN's National Catholic Register. Fascinating issue. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Lauren.
Il Signore invece spinge a ricordare, a riparare, a ricostruire
Pope Francis visited a cathedral in central Italy yesterday. It was damaged 3 years ago by an earthquake. The Holy Father donned a hard hat to pray in front of a damaged statue of the Blessed Virgin. He says the Lord calls us to make repairs together and not to leave anyone behind who is suffering. Clergy in Paris also put on their hard hats this weekend. On Saturday, Notre Dame Cathedral hosted its first Mass since the devastating fire 2 months ago. One priest called it a sign of progress.
We will rebuild this cathedral. It will take time, of course, a lot of money, a lot of time, a lot of work, but we will succeed. And today it's a small but a true victory.
The Mass was celebrated by the Archbishop of Paris. About 30 people attended, and most of them were priests and church employees, also wearing hard hats. Officials say the church remains in a fragile state. The ceiling is at risk of collapsing. The U.S. condemns Iran after the rogue regime announced it's ramping up its enrichment of uranium. Iranians say they will break from the 2015 landmark nuclear deal and pass the limit of what they are allowed to stockpile within 10 days. Now the U.S. is weighing its next steps. Correspondent Wyatt Goolsbee has been following this story. He reports from the State Department.
Good evening, Lauren. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo says the U.S. is considering a full range of options with Iran. He says taking military action is one of those possibilities, but President Trump has made it clear he does not want to go to war. State Department spokesperson Morgan Ortega says one thing's for certain, the administration will not allow Iran to acquire a nuclear weapon.
We, would say to the international community that we should not yield to nuclear extortion by the Iranian regime.
Morgan Ortega blasted Iran today for violating its own commitment to the international community by ratcheting up its uranium enrichment levels. A spokesman for Iran's atomic agency explained how his country had increased its uranium production fourfold. The move is likely aimed at putting pressure on Europe. Iran's President Hassan Rouhani says the 2015 nuclear deal can be saved and a resolution can be reached if European countries circumvent U.S. sanctions. President Donald Trump first imposed the sanctions after he withdrew the U.S. from the deal in May of 2018. Since then, the White House has engaged in what it calls a maximum pressure campaign. Middle East analyst Jim Phillips says Iran is feeling the impact.
And the fact that the Trump administration didn't give waivers really ratcheted up pressure much higher than Iran expected. And so this year, it's ejected its patient policy and it's ratcheted up tension.
Phillips says that includes last week's attacks on 2 oil tankers traveling near the Strait of Hormuz in the Persian Gulf. The U.S. says video evidence shows Iranian groups are to blame. But European foreign ministers, who are meeting today, say they want more evidence before wading into a potential diplomatic conflict.
Secretary Pompeo and the acting defense secretary, Patrick Shanahan, have urged its European allies to join the U.S. in its maximum pressure campaign, but many European leaders are hoping to salvage the nuclear deal. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says the international community should reinstate sanctions if Iran follows through on its threats. Lauren?
Correspondent Wyatt Goolsbee reporting from the State Department. Thank you, Wyatt. A Catholic group is protesting the governor of Guam's plan to recruit abortion providers. No doctors in the U.S. territory currently perform abortions. The Archdiocese has asked the governor to reconsider. A faith group says it will hold a prayer rally in protest. Guam is 85% Catholic. A federal court rules that undocumented teens in government shelters should have access to abortion. The decision blocks a Trump administration policy that prevented shelters from arranging abortions for migrant children. White House correspondent Mark Irons reports. Good evening, Mark.
Good evening, Lauren. Abortion advocates applaud this decision, but the pro-life community says this case is not closed.
Americans United for Life thinks the decision is tragic and very unfortunate.
That's the response from one pro-life group after Friday's decision from the District Court of Appeals in Washington, D.C. A 3-judge panel ruled that the Trump administration's policy preventing undocumented immigrant teens in government shelters from getting an abortion violated the Supreme Court precedent set by Roe v. Wade, legalizing abortion across the country.
No justice!
The American Civil Liberties Union filed the lawsuit. It writes, the Trump administration's cruel policy of blocking young immigrant women in federal custody from accessing abortion was a blatant abuse of power.
It's far from a blatant abuse of power when it simply restates the federal government's position, which it's held for over 40 years, that federal agencies, federal dollars, federal officers should not be involved in obtaining an elective abortion.
Stephen Aiden with Americans United for Life believes the case may now go before the full D.C. Court of Appeals, or even head to the Supreme Court, because the decision could impact more than just migrant facilities.
The decision on Friday could apply to all forms of federal and state custody, including corrections, juvenile detention, temporary detention.
If the case goes before the Supreme Court, then Justice Brett Kavanaugh likely won't take part. And that's because he ruled on the case at an earlier stage when he was still a judge on the D.C. Circuit, leaving 8 justices, 4 liberals and 4 conservatives on the High Court to make a ruling. At the White House, Mark Irons, EWTN News Nightly.
Thank you, Mark. Mark is going to be in Florida tomorrow as President Donald Trump officially launches his re-election campaign. You can watch his reports tomorrow on News Nightly and on social media. Now, the president won the swing state in 2016, and it's key to an election victory. Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi is going to join us now. There he is on the race to the White House. Good evening, Jason.
Good evening, Lauren. Florida has a track record of almost always siding with the winning presidential candidate. That winning streak goes all the way back to Herbert Hoover in 1928. Now, since then, only twice did they not pick the winner, JFK in 1960, and then in 1992, Bill Clinton. So it's no wonder then that Democratic groups want to stop the Trump train from again cruising through Florida.
People talk about Trump care. I want to say, Trump what? All the time.
Tonight, Democratic money pours into Florida.
Worrying about losing your insurance because of a pre-existing condition.
The goal, to stop President Trump from a second term.
The most important thing that we can do in this election in 2020 is what? Win, right? We must win this election.
But first, Democrats need to compete with each other. The Real Clear Politics average puts Joe Biden ahead, followed by Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, and Pete Buttigieg.
And so our job is each to present why we would make the best nominee, why we're the one best able to win, and why we'd make a great president.
They'll have that chance in the Democrats' first 2 debates.
We've got a chance in 2020 to turn that around and make this government work for the rest of America.
June 26, 10 candidates debate. And the next day, 10 more. All in Miami, the state that could decide who wins the White House. President Trump has visited Florida more than any other state.
To see this personally, it's very tough, very, very tough. Total devastation.
Seeing hurricane damage, meeting victims,
Nice cold.
And spending some holidays at his Mar-a-Lago resort in the Sunshine State. Republicans won this state in 2018, picking up a Senate seat by 10,000 votes and winning Florida's governor's mansion by 30,000 votes. The Associated Press found 2018 Florida voters were pretty evenly divided on whether they approved of the president. He rallied in Florida last month, promising to help hurricane victims. The president this month then signed a $19 billion bill to help victims of wildfires, flooding, and hurricanes. And that's one issue to pitch tomorrow when he returns to Florida. Lauren?
Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi. Thank you, Jason. The Supreme Court handed a small victory to bakers in Oregon who refused to make a cake for a same-sex wedding ceremony. The justices threw out a state court ruling against Sweet Cakes Bakery and ordered judges to take a new look at the case. The High Court will not consider the case by the 2020 election. Coming up, protests continue this weekend in Hong Kong, led by a retired Catholic cardinal. Hundreds of thousands of Hong Kong residents, including a retired Catholic cardinal, protested yesterday over the government's handling of a proposed extradition bill with China. Cardinal Joseph Zen is shown with gray hair and glasses. Demonstrators want the country's chief executive to resign and drop the proposal immediately. The Hong Kong government announced Saturday it will suspend the measure. There are fears the bill will curb the former British colony's freedoms and legal autonomy. Tonight, we're learning more about allegations that China may have engaged in forced organ harvesting of prisoners of conscience. The China Tribunal, which is an independent group in the UK, delivered its final report today after a year of analyzing available evidence. Joining me now by Skype from Charlotte, North Carolina, is Gary Bauer, Commissioner with USCIRF, the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. Gary, welcome back to our broadcast.
It's a pleasure to be with you, but it's horrifying to be here for such a terrible subject.
Horrible, horrible subject. It's being called transplant tourism. That's where people are now flocking to China to get needed organs. And if these accusations are true, thousands may have been killed for livers, kidneys, eyes. Some of them are believed to be religious minorities. Which groups are being targeted?
Well, it appears from the information that this commission was able to discern that the Falun Gong it appears to be particularly targeted for this sort of treatment. I think people need to keep in mind, however, that China's become an equal opportunity oppressor and violator of religious liberty. So whether we're hearing about the Uyghurs, the Muslim Chinese that are being put in camps, this particular targeting of the Falun Gong through these organ harvesting, or what's been done to Christian churches in China, the theme is the same. Any kind of religious belief, the Chinese Communist government seems to feel threatened by that and is willing to do almost anything to stop it.
Well, your organization, USCIRF, in a couple of weeks ago, months ago, said that China is a country of particular concern in your recommended report to Congress. And you said that there should be restrictions on the sale of surveillance and biometric equipment. How does that advanced technology factor into this process?
Well, this advanced technology, and in some cases we believe that some of it's been provided by American companies, this advanced technology is used by the Chinese Communist government to track people, to determine where they are, what they're saying, whether they're attending churches, are they engaged in religious activities that the Chinese government is threatened by. And then, of course, that leads to the arrests of prisoners of conscience. Great Chinese gulag is developing that even the old Soviet Union, I think, would be jealous of when you're talking about the number of people in that Chinese gulag. And then that leads to the kind of abuses that we're reading about today, where some of those prisoners are killed and their organs harvested for financial gain for the Chinese government and the Chinese Communist Party.
Well, other than sort of stopping that, what else can be done?
Well, we're urging on all of these issues for the United States government in any bilateral meetings with the Chinese to raise human rights and religious persecution issues in those meetings. It's important for us to do that so the world can be reminded of the kind of nation that China is today. We're also hoping that American companies, as they look for ways to maximize their own profits, may begin to consider with more seriousness, do they really want to be investing in a country that violates human rights and religious liberty to this degree that we're seeing in China?
It's a huge question. I asked Secretary Pompeo how important this is in these negotiations. You know, he says it's important, but it's hard to get a straight answer. Gary Bauer, Commissioner with the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. Thank you. The Polish priest who was ordained just weeks ago in his hospital bed has died. Father Michael Los was diagnosed with cancer in April. In May, Pope Francis granted a rare dispensation allowing him to be ordained both a deacon and a priest in the same Mass. His Orionine Fathers congregation announced his death on social media today. Up next, Be Not Troubled, a personal retreat based on a renowned spiritual classic. Pro-life groups are praising a changing initiative from Pampers. The company wants to put 5,000 diaper changing tables in men's restrooms in the U.S. and Canada. It was inspired by a Florida father's #SquatForChange campaign, which showed a picture of a squatting man himself on the floor of a public restroom, balancing his child on his knees while trying to change the child's diaper. For more on this story about the Love the Change campaign, visit our partners at CatholicNewsAgency.com. The latest book by a Catholic priest and moral theologian is helping the faithful learn to live in the present as they deepen their faith. In his latest book, Be Not Troubled, a 6-day personal retreat with Father Jean-Pierre de Caussade, Father Jeffrey Kirby introduces us, the faithful, to the spiritual teachings of a 17th century Jesuit priest. It's about his message of surrendering to God's will. And Father Jeffrey Kirby joins me now. Father Kirby, welcome back to our broadcast.
Thank you, Lauren. Good to be back.
I have to tell you, this book is really fabulous. How do teachings from the 17th century still hold up today? How is that possible?
It's got to be the power of the Holy Spirit. I think because, our hearts are the same, our desire for peace is the same, and truth is eternal. So sometimes we need these masters from 250 years ago to remind us of what's in our heart and how to get to what we want, what God has given to us to get there.
You go down the self-help aisle in the bookstore. Wait, is that a thing? Or you do it online?
Exactly.
I used to go down aisles in bookstores, but anyway. And you see books about living the moment, the presence of now, do everything right now, don't think, don't worry. How does living in the present bring us closer to holiness?
Yes, and these self-help books, it's not that they're wrong, they're just incomplete. Because, they want us to, again, we have this in our human heart. We want that sense of presence, we want that sense of connection, we want this peace. But oftentimes these contemporary efforts, they leave God out of it. So we end up finding this peace and realizing, why am I so alone? Why do I feel so lonely? But here we know when we pursue this sense of peace, and masters like Father de Caussade can help us, that when we get there, we realize we're not alone, that actually we dwell in communion. So even as we want this peace, it's not my peace. It's a peace that we have, that I have in God.
In high school, I had there's this picture with footsteps, the footsteps in the sand, and it was basically saying, when you think you're alone, you're not, God's carrying you. And it's sort of that same theme. Tell us about the personal story about your father's diagnosis of dementia. How is he?
Yes, he's good, thanks be to God. My mom and my older brother are heroes in their care for him. And I put that story in the book. It's about my father's diagnosis with dementia. He's retired military. We used to call him the mean green fight machine. Dad always had together. Dad was always in control. And it was difficult when he received this diagnosis and now to watch this play itself out. And yet, even in that, to find that my father is not responding with anger, which we were afraid of, but instead very much living in the present moment. I put that in the book because as my father has learned that and witnesses that to us, I had to learn that.
Because you're probably angry.
Right, and confused and uncertain, and to say, what was the past is the past, what was the future is the future, but to be here now. And so when I'm spending time with my father, it's not what he used to be, but it's Dad who's in front of me. And that's the power of the present moment, to be with ourselves, to be with other people, to be with God. So it was a hard story, Lauren, to put in there, but if we're going to talk about this, there has to be credibility. And I wanted people to understand this isn't some, abstract theory that some priest is putting on paper. No, this is real life in the trenches. There's real suffering, there's real hardship, but in every moment, God provides the grace for us to do it, to find that peace that he desires for us to have. So.
And I have to say that, this contemporary look back at something that's centuries old really gives us hope in faith, in our faith.
Yes, and to me it's very exciting that, as you were saying, that this perennial truth, this truth that is there, that we constantly get to rediscover it, retrieve it, reapply it. So what was true 250 years ago is true. But
or 2,000 years
ago. 2,000 years ago, right.
You want to go there.
Exactly, right. And yet the lessons haven't changed.
Right,
so,
very good. Great. Well, we'll leave it there. Father Jeffrey Kirby, author of Be Not Troubled, a 6-day personal retreat with Father Jean-Pierre de Caussade. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you for joining us. For all of us here at EWTN News Nightly, to all of you around the world, we hope you have a blessed evening. I'm Lauren Ashburn. Let's keep in touch online. Follow me at Lauren Ashburn on Twitter and Lauren Ashburn EWTN on Facebook. Before we go, prayers for Jessica Marquez, a producer of ours who's lost her grandmother. Good night, and God bless you.